This story belongs to one of my friends, Terri. Growing up, Terri would babysit her cousin's 2-year-old son. One late night, as he was sleeping in his bedroom, Terri was laying down on her cousin's bed, skimming through old magazines. She couldn't help but notice how eerily silent the house was. The only sounds that accompanied her were the pages of the magazines gently being grazed by her fingers. Then suddenly, the silence was broken by keys rattling, the front door opening, then closing, footsteps walking towards the kitchen, and then keys being dropped on the counter. The footsteps continued down the hallway and then stopped. Terri thought it was just her cousin who came back from her night out, so she called out her name, but there was no response. She waited and then called out her name again, and still there was no answer. Silence filled the air. Terri was frozen in fear. She didn't know what to do. She just sat on the bed alone, holding her breath, praying that it wasn't a break-in. That's when she heard the keys again, rattling non-stop. Terri was petrified and submitted to the bed. She sat like that and didn't move a single muscle until her cousin returned with her husband from their evening date. Horrified, Terri told them what happened. They both laughed at her and didn't believe her story. No matter how much she pleaded her case, they would just continue to laugh. Defeated, Terri gave up on trying to explain herself. Any sensible person would stop babysitting after that experience. But Terri was too nice and agreed to babysit again the following weekend. She knew her cousin needed a babysitter and figured that the experience was all in her head. So when the weekend finally came around, Terri found herself in the same situation. Once her cousin and her husband left, she put their son asleep, laid across her cousin's bed, and started reading magazines. The preternatural silence made Terri uneasy again. Then, like clockwork, she heard the rattling, the front door opening and closing, footsteps walking towards the kitchen, keys hitting the counter, followed by footsteps walking down the hall. Only this time, the footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. Terri didn't call out. She sat frozen, solidified to her cousin's bed. The keys didn't rattle again. She just sat there waiting to hear anything. The silence engulfed her in fear. Eventually, her cousin returned with her husband, which released the grip of fear that wrapped itself over Terri. Terri told them about the rattling, and again they laughed at her in disbelief. She didn't know what was worse, the horrifying rattling or not being believed. It wouldn't be until her family experienced the rattling for themselves that Terri would get her clarity. One night, Terri, her cousin, mother and father, who was a police officer, were all laughing and hanging out together in her cousin's bedroom. Then very abruptly, their laughing was ruptured by keys rattling by the front door. The door opened and then slammed shut. Footsteps walking towards the kitchen, keys being placed on the counter, then footsteps walking down the hall. Terri's family was so scared that you could hear their heartbeats within the silence. That's when Terri's father got his off-duty gun, eased his way down the hallway, and scanned the entire house. He found no one and nothing. After being a skeptic his whole life, Terri's father became a believer in the paranormal that night. Terri's cousin moved out and the family never went back to the house. Terri was relieved that she never had to babysit in that house again, thinking that she would never have to hear that dreadful rattling. After a couple of months, Terri and her family would move into her grandparents' old house. The house was empty one night, except for one pool table that was delivered early. Terri and one of her other cousins, one closer to her age, decided to visit the house and play some pool. They were having a great time until they heard keys being rattled. Then they heard footsteps coming towards the pool room, and then stop. They both just stared at each other in silence, not moving a muscle. Terri eventually mustered the courage to speak. She asked if anyone was there, and there was no response. Terri could see the panic in her cousin's eyes. Her whole family knew about the rattling. She figured that she needed to take control of the situation, so she told her cousin, "We need to leave now." In agreement, her cousin nodded, and they slowly walked out the back door, and bolted whenever they made it outside. That was the last time Terri heard the rattling. At first, she thought it was a spirit trapped in time, reliving the same event over and over again, or just a spirit trying to find its way back home. But since the rattling followed her to her grandparents' old house, she's convinced that someone or something was following her, and that it attached itself to her whenever she was babysitting and heard the rattling for the first time.